So Dr. Noble, where are you now? Where are you presenting from?
I'm in my office in New York at the university.
Nice. Great. All right. Well, we have a great number of participants on with us already. So I think that we can go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Lorna Quant, and I'm here today to help lead today's presentation. First, I'll ask for an introduction of our lecturer, our presenter today, but that's not going to be my part. So I'm going to introduce our introducer. Please welcome to the Zoom stage, Casey. Casey Spellman. Thanks, Casey. So Casey is one of our PhD students here in the Educational Neuroscience program. Casey, take it away. Great, thank you. And welcome to the PhD in Educational Neuroscience Distinguished Lecture hosted by Gallaudet University. This lecture series aims to honor world-renowned scientists in the fields of psychology, education, cognitive sciences, and neuroscience. These different fields, and all the interdisciplinary fields in between, contribute to the new and growing field of educational neuroscience. They increase our understanding of the human mind and the neural mechanisms of learning. This year's Distinguished Lecture Series theme is From Brain Development to Developing Virtual Brains. I'm honored to introduce our distinguished lecturer today, Dr. Kimberly Noble. Dr. Noble is an associate professor of neuroscience and education at Teachers College, Columbia University. And she's also a board-certified pediatrician. She's the director of the Neurocognition, Early Experience, and Development Lab, otherwise known as NEED. In this lab, she and her team study how socioeconomic inequality relates to children's cognitive, emotional, and brain development. She has funding from the NIH and private foundations, and is one of the principal investigators of a study called Baby's First Years. This is the first clinical trial of poverty reduction in the first 3 years of life. Dr. Noble received her undergraduate, graduate, and medical degrees at the University of Pennsylvania and completed her medical residency in pediatrics at Columbia University Medical Center. She was a recipient of the Association for Psychological Science Janet Taylor Spence Award for transformative early career contributions, and a recipient of the American Psychological Association Award for distinguished contributions to psychology in the public interest. She's also a fellow of the Association for Psychological Science. Her TED Talk has received more than 2 million views to date, and her work has received worldwide attention in the popular press. Today, we'll learn more about Dr. Noble's work on socioeconomic disparities in cognitive development. The title of her talk is Socioeconomic Inequality and Children's Brain Development. And now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Noble. Dr. Noble?
Thank you so much for that warm welcome, Dr.
Thank
Quant.
you also, Casey. Very wonderful introduction.
Yes, thank you so much.
Okay, so actually just before we hand it over to you, Dr. Noble, to have you begin your presentation, I did need just to check off a couple of important housekeeping items. To our audience members, all 98 of you, please be sure to use the Q&A feature for any of your questions. If you have a question that you want our presenter to answer at the designated time, please, again, make sure to click the QA button at the bottom of your screen. We will be able to see all of the questions that have been answered at the completion of the presentation. You can also use the chat feature. Please use that, though, for maybe comments about something relevant to the presentation, something you find interesting or something that you've learned. So you can use that for comments, but remember that we won't be using the chat during the Q&A session. So just to make clear that distinction, QA is for your actual questions for the presenter, chat box is just for commentary and reactions. Also, for anyone who needs to or would like to see the captions, there is a link in the chat to the captioning. I think that covers it. So thank you so much again, and I am greatly looking forward to your talk. The floor is yours, Dr. Noble.
Thank you so much. It's really such a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for the warm invitation. I do have a tendency to talk quickly, but I'll try to modulate that. Interpreters, please let me know if you need me to slow down. Likewise, my plan is to show the slides for 10 to 20 seconds before speaking about them. But if you need me to go slower, again, please let me know. I'm going to go ahead and share my slides now. All right. So as students and trainees who are studying neuroscience, most people would agree that early experience helps to shape brain development. And it turns out that the brain is highly plastic or malleable to experience early in childhood. But of course, a child's experiences vary tremendously as a function of their social and economic family factors. And so today we'll speak about how a child's social and economic circumstances work together to shape children's brain development. And so one way that in my lab we study social and economic circumstances is by understanding poverty and asking how poverty relates to children's outcomes. So let's take a step back and ask, what exactly do we mean when we talk about poverty? So in the United States, poverty is defined by the federal government as a lack of economic resources needed to attain a minimal standard of living. Now, here in the US, that threshold is set according to family size and composition, meaning the number of adults and children in the home. Currently, the poverty line is set for a family with 2 adults and 2 children at just under $28,000. And that's despite the fact that the poverty line is the same regardless of whether you live in a high cost of living place like New York City or a much lower cost of living place like parts of the rural Midwest, for example. And yet, despite the poverty line being relatively low, it nonetheless affects many millions of children. So currently, if we look at all children in the United States, about 15% are living in poverty. And this is compared to 11% of all individuals. And so we can see that children are about 50% more likely to live in poverty compared to the US population as a whole. Now, when we talk about socioeconomic status, or SES, we're talking about more than just poverty. So poverty, as I mentioned, is defined strictly based on family income, whereas SES comprises other characteristics as well, things like parents' educational attainment, occupational prestige, and subjective social status, or where one sees oneself on the social hierarchy. And we know that when childhood SES is conceptualized in this way, it tends to be strongly associated with a number of important cognitive developmental outcomes. Things like achievement test scores, grade retention, literacy, IQ, and school graduation rates. Now, we might ask what factors are contributing to this socioeconomic gap in children's outcomes. And you all could likely think of many possibilities. Differences in things like nutrition, access to healthcare, exposure to environmental toxicants like secondhand smoke or lead, differences in the home learning environment, or schooling, or stress. And to this laundry list and the many others that you all could likely come up with, I would say yes, really each of those has been shown to contribute in part to the link between socioeconomic factors and children's cognitive outcomes. So how do we make sense of that? Well, one way is to recognize that so-called cognitive skill is too broad of an outcome, by which I mean that traditional achievement measures like IQ or school graduation rates aren't specific to certain brain functions. Put another way, there's no high school graduation nucleus in our brain. So we can be much more specific in asking which particular cognitive skills and corresponding brain circuitry are most strongly associated with socioeconomic factors. So that brings us to a neuroscience approach. Neuroscience, of course, teaches us that different structures and circuits in the brain support different kinds of cognitive skills. And so by taking a neuroscience approach, we can ask which core cognitive systems vary the most along socioeconomic lines. And so that was exactly the approach that my collaborators and I took about 20 years ago when we recruited several socioeconomically diverse samples of families with young children. And we asked across this socioeconomic range, what cognitive outcomes seem to be most strongly associated with socioeconomic factors. And from kindergarten on up through adolescence, our results were pretty consistent. We tended to find robust socioeconomic differences in children's language development, with more modest but consistent differences in memory and certain aspects of executive function. And so that led us to several lines of research that our lab has been pursuing, building on that early work. So first, how do these socioeconomic differences in children's cognitive development relate to underlying differences in the structure and function of their brains? Second, just how early in childhood are these disparities detectable? Third, which experiences, especially modifiable experiences, explain socioeconomic differences in children's outcomes. And finally, how can this work inform interventions? So tackling the first of those questions, how do these differences relate to underlying differences in children's brain structure? So in a study that we conducted several years ago using the pediatric imaging, neurocognition, and genetics data, which was a large sample of more than 1,000 children and adolescents recruited from a number of sites around the United States, we asked, to what extent do socioeconomic factors like parents' education or family income relate to the structure of children's brains? And we were specifically focused on the surface area of the cerebral cortex, or the thin outer layers of cells on the outer surface of our brain that's responsible for most higher order cognition. And we found that across these more than 1,000 children and adolescents, on average, higher family income was associated with a larger cortical surface area across nearly the entire surface of the brain. And this was particularly notable in regions shown here in yellow, areas like perisylvian cortex that support language development, and parts of prefrontal cortex like anterior cingulate cortex that support executive functioning. So the brain structural data really recapitulated what we had found previously behaviorally. And there were a couple of very important points to take away. First, this link between family income and children's brain structure was strongest among the most disadvantaged children. So that means that dollar for dollar, relatively modest differences in family income were associated with proportionately greater differences in children's brain structure among the poorest families. And intuitively, that makes some sense. Because if you think about a family earning $100,000 a year, if you were to give them an extra $10,000 a year, that would probably be nice, but probably wouldn't dramatically change their day-to-day lives. Whereas if you were to give an extra $10,000 a year to a family only earning $20,000 a year, that would likely make a pretty remarkable difference in their day-to-day lives. And secondly, and this point is key, there was tremendous variability from one child to the next. By which I mean there were plenty of children from higher income homes with smaller brain surfaces, and plenty of children from lower income homes with larger brain surfaces. So in no way could I know an individual child's family income and predict with any accuracy what that particular child's brain would look like. Okay, so let's move on to our second line of research. How early are these differences detectable? So this is work that we did a couple of years, or several years ago now, in which we longitudinally followed a group of infants and toddlers who were recruited from socioeconomically diverse homes. So on the x-axis, you see age in months. And on the y-axis, we have z-score of a language composite. So a compilation of several different language skills that we measured in these infants and toddlers. And for display purposes, I've broken the data into thirds of parental education. So the blue line represents the children of the most highly educated parents in the sample. The red line represents the children of middle educated parents. And the green line represents the children of the least educated parents in the sample. And what we see is that from 9 to 15 months, these lines are pretty flat, meaning we're not really seeing the emergence of socioeconomic disparities just yet. But from 15 to 21 months of age, what we see is that this blue line rises to the top of the distribution, whereas unfortunately, this green line falls to the bottom of the distribution. And the difference between the blue line and the green line at 21 months of age is not just statistically significant, but it's also clinically significant. So that difference represents a difference of about 0.8 standard deviations, which is a large statistical effect. And to put that in magnitude, that's equivalent to a difference of 12 IQ points. Now, this wasn't an IQ test, it was a composite of language measures, but that nonetheless gives you a sense of how large the disparities already are by the time children turn 2. Okay, now, what about taking a look under the hood to measure brain development early in life? So the images I showed you before were taken using MRI, which is great for older children or adults, but requires children to lie perfectly still in a dark and noisy tube. So it's much more difficult to measure MRI using among infants and toddlers. So instead, we break out another tool in our toolbox, namely electroencephalography, or EEG. And we use EEG to measure infants' brain activity by placing this cap of electrodes on the child's scalp. And you could think of these electrodes as similar to microphones, which listen in to the infant's brain activity. Now, of course, we're not mind readers. We don't know what a child's thinking, but we're able to use EEG to measure the speed of electrical signals. Now, we all have some fast electrical signals and some slow electrical signals in our brains. But we care about the amount of fast versus slow electrical signals for several reasons. So first of all, we know that as children grow and develop, they tend to have more high frequency or fast-paced brain activity and less low frequency or slow-paced brain activity. Additionally, we know that children who are at risk for learning or attention problems often tend to show less high frequency or fast-paced activity and more low frequency or slow-paced activity compared to their peers. And finally, we also know that children growing up in poverty or facing other forms of early adversity often show less high frequency and more low frequency power compared to their more advantaged peers. And so we were interested in asking, to what extent do we see the emergence of socioeconomic differences in children's brain activity very early in life? So we used EEG to ask, to what extent do we see associations between socioeconomic factors like parents' education and family income and children's brain activity very early in life, in the first few days of life. And the answer was really not at all. So in this study, we compared across a group of newborn infants who came from diverse socioeconomic backgrounds, and we asked, to what extent would income be related to differences in children's brain activity? And here on the y-axis, I'm showing you very high frequency or very fast-paced brain activity. And what you see is that there's really no indication of any association between family income and brain activity. And that was true in every frequency bands, in every location across the scale. But between 6 and 12 months of age, we begin to see the emergence of socioeconomic disparities in children's brain activity, such that towards the end of the first year of life, children from more advantaged backgrounds tend to show more of that high frequency or fast-paced brain activity compared to children from less advantaged backgrounds. So what experiences might be explaining these differences? I showed you this slide before. In my lab, we're particularly interested in several of these, and I'm gonna spend a few minutes talking about one of them, namely family stress. So the evidence is clear that families facing socioeconomic disadvantage often experience higher levels of stress. And we know that when family life is characterized by stress or conflict, that parents are often less able to engage with their children in the kinds of warm and nurturing ways that we know are so important for children's development. Likewise, we know that there are certain brain regions that are highly sensitive to stress, namely areas like the hippocampus and prefrontal cortex, which happen to be areas that also vary quite a bit along socioeconomic lines. And so we reasoned that perhaps differences in chronic stress might explain socioeconomic differences in those brain regions. We measured chronic stress by measuring stress hormone or cortisol, which we can do by taking a small sample of hair. And indeed, we found that children who had higher levels of cortisol in their hair tended to have a smaller hippocampus. And so far, I've tried to present a model by which we think that socioeconomic disparities lead to differences in experience, using the example of stress, and in turn that differences in experience might lead to differences in children's brain development and ultimately to differences in cognition and behavior. And so if we're right and experience matters, it begs the question as to whether this work can inform interventions, and if so, what's the right level at which to intervene? So certainly many interventions have focused on intervening at the level of cognition or behavior itself, most commonly through school-based interventions. And there are also many interventions that focus at the level of experience, such as, for example, trying to reduce stress levels or encourage parents to engage in more conversations with their children. But for the rest of this talk, I'm going to challenge you to thinking about what it might be like to focus at the level of socioeconomic disparities themselves. So work by my social science colleagues has suggested that a relatively modest difference in annual income early in life has been associated with a number of improvements for children later in life. Things like higher cognitive test scores, increased earnings when the children grow up, increased time spent in the labor force, and even some evidence for improved health. But I know you all know the saying that correlation is not causation. And many people would say, well, sure, poverty is associated with these outcomes, but poverty isn't causing those outcomes. It's all the things associated with poverty, or perhaps even the choices that parents are making. And regardless about how you feel about that statement from an ideological perspective, the best way to answer that question from a scientific perspective is through the gold standard of scientific studies, a randomized controlled trial. And so launching such a randomized controlled trial has been the goal of the Baby's First Year study. So Baby's First Years, which I'm proud to be one of the principal investigators of, is the first randomized controlled trial of poverty reduction in early childhood. And it's a very interdisciplinary effort led by economists, neuroscientists, and policy experts. So what exactly are we doing? So back in the spring of 2018, we began recruiting 1,000 mothers living with low income in 4 metropolitan areas around the United States. Upon enrolling in the study, all mothers were offered the opportunity to receive a monthly cash gift that they would be free to spend however they would like, no strings attached. But they were randomized into one of two groups. So the mothers in what we call the high cash gift group are receiving $333 a month, whereas the mothers in the low cash gift group are receiving $20 a month. Mothers get these gifts on a debit card that comes preloaded in the hospital and that automatically reloads each month on the day of the child's birthday. So for example, my daughter is born on May 27th. And so if I were a participant in the study, I would get the gift every month on the 27th of the month. Now, to date, we've given out more than $5 million to the mothers in the study. And by studying the differential impact of poverty reduction in these two groups, we'll actually be able to assess the causal impact of poverty reduction on early childhood development. So how do we expect that these economic resources are likely to impact children? So we've got two main pathways that we've hypothesized. The first we call the increased investment pathway. And that's the idea that with greater economic resources, moms are more likely to be able to purchase things like books and toys, perhaps higher quality childcare, maybe better housing and safer neighborhoods. And the other pathway is one we call the reduced stress pathway. And that's the idea that if moms are less worried about how they're going to pay that monthly rent check or keep the lights on, they're more likely to be able to engage with their children in the kinds of warm and nurturing ways that we know are so important for child development. So with apologies for a busy slide, let me walk you through the data collection that we have done to date. So we've recruited the moms in the postpartum wards of the hospital just a day or two after they gave birth over the course of a year, beginning in spring 2018. Then a year into the cash gifts, we had our first wave of follow-up around the children's first birthdays. At that time, we began traveling into the families' homes to conduct a survey, to observe and code parent-child interactions, to take a measure of mom's stress physiology, stress hormones, to get a maternal report of the child's language and social emotional development, and to take a measure of the infant's brain activity using EEG. Now, partway through this age 1 wave of data collection, the pandemic hit. So while we were able to quickly pivot to phone-based data collection for the survey, that meant that some of the data that we were collecting could no longer be collected because you can't measure infant brain activity over the phone. So I'm going to be showing you some of the results from the very first findings in a few moments. And so I want you to realize that the infant brain activity findings are based on data that were collected before the onset of the pandemic in a truncated age 1 sample. Our age 2 wave of data collection was again limited to phone-based survey data collection, as is age 3 data collection, which is currently ongoing. But we're very much looking forward to the children's 4th birthdays, at which point our plan is to once again resume in-person data collection. So our plan is to invite the families into our university research labs to again measure children's brain activity, but more importantly, also be able to directly assess children's cognitive and behavioral development. So this is just a picture of what the debit card looks like. It was branded the For My Baby card. I told you some of the information on this slide already, but one thing to note is that to the extent possible, this money didn't count against determining mothers' eligibility for government social services and benefits. And that's very important, because if we were to give out unconditional cash support, and receiving that cash support meant that moms would no longer qualify for things like Medicaid or food stamps, that would be ethically problematic and also would be a terrible scientific design. So in work led by my social science colleagues, Catherine Magnuson and Lisa Janetian, before the launch of the study, we actually, in 2 of the 4 cities, went agency by agency to ensure that this money wouldn't count in determining eligibility for benefits. And in the other 2 states, we actually got state legislation passed saying that for these moms in this study, this money wouldn't count in determining their eligibility for benefits. Okay, so I'm going to now go over the results of the first study that came out of baby's first years. You may have seen it. It got a good amount of press. It came out just over a month ago now. And I want to emphasize the fact that this study is really just the tip of the iceberg for baby's first years. We've got a number of other papers in various stages in the pipeline, in preparation and under review. And as I mentioned, this is just from age 1. We've got data from age 2, ongoing at age 3, and upcoming at age 4. So lots more of the story to come. So before I show you the results of what we found, I want to really give credit to our EEG team led by my postdoc, Sonia Troller-Renfrey, in what was really an unprecedented and successful mobile EEG data collection effort. So usually when we collect EEG, we measure it in a very controlled setting in the lab. But here we were taking EEG into the home of mothers with 1-year-olds, potentially other siblings and pets and all of the other distractions that occur in the home. And despite that, it was a very successful data collection effort. So the vast majority of families agreed to try it. In 84% of the in-person visits, the babies were successfully capped, yielding high quality usable data in 435 of the infants, or 72% of the in-person sample. So that's similar to the success rate we would have expected in the lab setting. So as a reminder, past work has suggested that growing up in poverty is often associated with less high frequency or fast-paced brain activity and more low frequency or slower paced brain activity. And that's important because this pattern has unfortunately been associated with subsequent learning and attention difficulties in school. And so we wanted to set out to ask, would cash gifts reverse this pattern? And specifically, we hypothesized that the infants of the moms in the high cash gift group would show more high frequency power and less low frequency power compared to the infants of the moms in the low cash gift group. So now let me walk you through what we actually found. Okay, so here on the x-axis, we have frequency. So low frequency on the left and high frequency on the right. And on the y-axis, we have power, which is how we quantify brain activity. And the black line represents the high cash gift group. And the gray line represents the low cash gift group. So what we can see is at the low end of the frequency spectrum, the infants in the low cash gift group have a little bit more low frequency power than the infants of the high cash gift group. Though this difference is not statistically significant. But as we get to the higher frequency range, we see a crossover effect where the infants in the high cash gift group are consistently showing more high frequency power than the infants in the low cash gift group. Now, historically, when we analyze EEG data, we don't look at it continuously like this. Instead, we look at it in frequency bands that are unhelpfully named with Greek letters. So this is actually written in Greek. And so we think about low frequency power as theta, middle frequency as alpha, high frequency as beta, and very high frequency as gamma. And so when we look at differences between the high cash gift group and the low cash gift group in these 4 frequency bands, we see statistically significant differences in the beta and gamma high frequency band, with the high cash gift group showing more of this high frequency power compared to the low cash gift group. But when we adjust for 4 multiple comparisons, those effects are no longer statistically significant. Now you'll recall that we had a much smaller sample than we initially intended because of the pandemic. So we looked at these data several other ways. One way was to create a composite of the 3 mid to high frequency bands. When we do that, when we treat alpha, beta, and gamma together as a single composite, we do see a statistically significant difference with the infants in the high cash gift group showing more mid to high frequency power than the infants of the moms in the low cash gift group. Likewise, something that we were very interested in was understanding where in the brain these differences might be coming from. So here I'm showing you heat maps of EEG power distributed across the scalp. The brains on the left represent the average across the high cash gift group. And the brains on the right represent the average across the low cash gift group. And here I'm showing you absolute beta or fast-paced high-frequency brain activity, and absolute gamma or very fast-paced, very high-frequency brain activity. And you can clearly see that the high cash gift group is showing more of this fast-paced brain activity than the low cash gift group. And furthermore, this is being driven by frontal and central brain regions, which we know support the development of subsequent thinking and learning. And indeed, these regional differences remain significant even when adjusting for multiple comparisons. And so taking into account the weight of the evidence across all of our analyses, we concluded that the weight of the evidence suggested that reducing poverty may indeed cause changes in children's developing brains in a pattern associated with the subsequent development of higher cognitive skills. Because of the randomized controlled trial design, this is the strongest evidence to date that income may matter in and of itself for children's brain development. Now, of course, because brain data could only be collected prior to the onset of the pandemic, we had limited power, and we can't be certain that some of our analyses are not the result of chance. But as I mentioned early on, this is just the beginning for babies' first years. So we are in the process of analyzing our age 2 wave of data collection. We're in the process of collecting data at age 3. And most importantly, we've got a second chance. So when the children reach their 4th birthdays, they'll be invited into our university lab so that once again, we can measure brain activity and even more importantly, directly measure cognition and behavior. Now we're often asked about what are the policy implications for a baby's first years. And it's our hope that we'll have the potential to provide evidence of the effects of poverty reduction on the developing child and family life. It's clear that the policy landscape around cash support to low-income families has changed dramatically in the past decade. And it's our hope that we'll be able to inform debates on the generosity or cuts both to existing safety net programs as well as potential new programs like tax refunds or child allowances. Because while income may not be the only or even the most important factor in determining child development, it may be one that's particularly easily changed by policy. So with that, I thank you very much for your attention. We're very grateful to our collaborators, funders, and especially the mothers who contribute their time and are willing to share their lives with us so that we may learn about the impact of poverty reduction. And finally, I'll just say that we're hiring a postdoc, a lab manager, and research assistants. And so we're very happy to have people reach out if you are interested or know people who might be interested in those roles. And I, 1 minute ago, got a phone call from my babysitter, which is not something you ever want to see. I'm just going to mute for 1 second and make sure that there's nothing I need to take care of.
Perfectly fine. Please go right ahead. Please do. So I'll just chat with the audience to say, wow, what a phenomenal talk. Please keep putting in your questions into the Q&A feature. If you have maybe just a comment instead or a point that you'd like to bring up, that is also fine to include in the Q&A. I am currently looking at all of the comments that have been submitted so far. And I see some comments and some conversation about the kind of money participants got, like if they knew how much other participants were getting as well. And then I see a question here from Ilaria about a lump sum versus a monthly amount. So we can certainly bring that question up for discussion. Dr. Noble, is everything okay with the babysitter?
Yes, happy to answer questions.
Okay, thank you. All right. I know that sense of fear. Yeah. Okay. So I was just saying, I see a question that was just posed in the chat box from Dr. Bertoletti. She says that she is wondering if a lump sum or monthly amount might be important in terms of the timing of how the money was distributed. Is that an integral part to the design of the study?
It is. And so, I'm not an economist, but this was a strong, an aspect of the study design that we considered very strongly at the outset. So there is some work to suggest that people spend money very differently if they get a regular monthly outlay versus getting a lump sum once a year. So as you might imagine, a lump sum once a year tends to be more strongly associated with, one-time big purchases, a washing machine, for example. Whereas regular monthly payments seem to be put more toward the regular everyday household expenditures. And so we reasoned that the kinds of things that were more likely to support child development really fit more strongly in the latter category. And so that's why we made that decision.
Got it. Following up on that question, I was actually wondering about how the amounts were decided. So the final decision was 20 in the low cash, but then 333 in the high cash. So I see that there's a big difference, but how did you reach those numbers?
Yeah,
and
great.
I was just wondering if there was any like behind the scenes, I don't know, explanation, you know, that maybe it should it have been 0? Should it have been 100 in the high cash or 1,000 in the high cash? So could you tell us a little bit how that decision was made to go with 20 and 333?
Absolutely. So those numbers were chosen very intentionally. So $333 a month amounts to about $4,000 a year. And so work by my social science colleagues has suggested that $4,000 a year is associated with a number of important outcomes for children, things like school achievement as well as subsequent health. So it was an amount that we thought was likely to move the needle. At the same time, we thought it was a policy relevant amount because it's an amount similar in size to other social services and benefits that moms living with low income may qualify for. So we tried to hit that sweet spot of both an amount that we thought would make a difference for the kids and an amount that policymakers would actually sit up and care about. You know, put another way, even if we could have somehow raised the funds to give every family $50,000, right, it is highly unlikely that something like that would be translated into policy.
Got it. Makes sense. Thank you for that explanation. Let's see. Now I see a question here in the Q&A from Dr. Alyssa Newport. She says, these are fabulous effects. Wonderful talk. I know that you don't know this yet, but what exactly causes the beneficial effects of money? Excuse me, you don't know yet what exactly causes the beneficial effects of money, but what are your thoughts on this?
Right, we don't know yet, and we are trying to work to unpack that.
Well, she's also asking if you could sort of speculate,
Yeah.
if you could say what you're thinking. She also just says, maybe it's stress reduction, and what do you think the effects of on high frequency brain rhythms suggest is happening?
So we've got several papers in the works trying to unpack, you know, is it more investment? Is it more stress? Is it both? In some ways, the beauty of unrestricted cash is that the answer might actually vary from one family to the next, right? Maybe one family is buying more books. Maybe another family is choosing, the mom is choosing to work a little bit less to have more time at home. Maybe a third family uses it to afford a nicer apartment, right? So chances are it is somewhat different from one family to the next. That said, we are very interested in trying to look for such patterns. So we have one paper under review led by one of our economist colleagues, Lisa Janetian, where she's finding a number of differences in expenditures, especially child-focused expenditures. So things like books and toys, as well as the ways that parents are spending their time with their children. Interestingly, a question that we get all the time is, do you expect that the families are going to squander the money? And while the literature really doesn't support that that's the idea that that's likely, we're also not seeing that in our data. So a paper that was just accepted yesterday, I guess, shows that we're not seeing any differences. Thank you. We're not seeing any differences in spending on or use of substances, alcohol, tobacco, opioids. We have other work looking into differences in stress, since that was one of the hypothesized mechanisms. And it's early yet in our analyses, but we're not seeing clear evidence of reduction of stress counter to our hypotheses.
Interesting. Your recent comment, does that mean that you do have data about what participants are spending money on and what they're doing with the money?
We sure do.
So do
Yeah.
you have that saved somewhere? Okay.
We sure do. So at each wave of data collection, we've done quite a bit of surveys with the moms to understand things like how they're spending the money, how their household expenditures have changed, how they're spending their time. So we've got both maternal report of child-focused expenditures, for example, as well as for the moms who've given us permission, we have information on the transactions themselves from the debit cards.
That must be really interesting data to have collected. Wow. All right, let's see. I'll take another look at the Q&A box, see what we have there. And also, Dr. Noble, if you would like to take a look at the Q&A yourself,
Sure.
And there's one that you want to answer, please do let me know or just go right ahead. So I see a question here from our chat box. It's also typed into the Q&A. And this has to do with ethics.
Yeah.
So I think that we've already had some good discussion in the chat already during your talk, but could you address the question of how was it ethically to make this decision to give a substantial amount of money to one group and then a relatively insubstantial amount to another group? And how did that affect the team's decision making? How did you address the ethics of it overall?
Well, so it's such a great question. So I think the first point to note is I think it's we'd be hard pressed to suggest that we're doing harm to a group, right? Everybody is getting some money. Nobody, of course, is losing any money. So nobody is worse off than where they started. So in terms of the ethics on that front, I think we can very safely say we're doing no harm. Now, sort of inherent or implied in this question is the idea that we already know the answer. We already know that money is good for people. And if that were true and everybody agreed with that, then I would say, you're right. Why would we need to do the study? But as I alluded to earlier, there are plenty of people who think, well, it's not money itself. It's other things associated with money. Or, we shouldn't be giving people money. We should be giving them services. And I'll point out, it doesn't need to be an either or, right? We can think about giving people money and services. But there really hasn't been a study to directly assess the effect of poverty reduction in and of itself on children's outcomes, especially early in childhood. And I think that's really important because, like we've said, cash is fungible. Cash has the power to empower families to use it as they see fit. So from that respect, it's very different than providing specific types of services. And so I think it's actually really important to use a scientific framework to be able to ask, to what extent does poverty reduction in and of itself make a difference for children?
I agree with you completely. I think it's really great to see that you can just give money directly to someone and it's not even about what each family does with it. They're going to have their own priorities and their own plans for what to do with this money, and that's not the part that's important. That's not the part that's key. The part is just to give them the extra finances that allows them to do the things that they need. I love that. I think also recognizing that maybe giving the families this money, especially the higher amount of money, like if you give them that money, it can become much bigger than just the amount that was initially given to them. Because, for example, let's say that they buy a new car. That may then also mean they could get a better job, or they could, X, Y, and Z. Like there could be a number of cascading effects of getting more, or that you can do more with just the 333 alone. There may be other effects.
Absolutely.
All right, so I did want to ask one of our participants, Seema Azang, has their hand raised. I'd like them to be given panelist permission so that they can come on camera and ask their question.
Sure.
So let's pause just a moment to ensure that Seema has the panelist permission.
Hi, Dr. Nobel.
Hi.
It was very, very interesting research and the results. But thank you for your work. And also, I wanted to thank you personally for speaking articulated and slowly. So it made me to be involved and be part of your audience. Thank you very much. I am deaf myself, and I do lip reading, and I grew up with my hearing parents. So I was interested in seeing the similar result for the deaf children or of the hearing parents. So because it makes stress and anxiety in the hearing parents for the children. I mean, the stress and the anxiety. Does it make it similar effect, or how can we compare it, or what is your idea? What is your opinion about it? Thank you very much.
Thank you for the question and for the kind words. I want to make sure I understand your question. So I heard you ask about anxiety of deaf children born to hearing parents. Is that correct?
Yes, yes.
Okay. And was the question specifically related to some of the findings I showed you? I'm just not sure what the question was per se in relation to what we spoke about earlier, and I'm sorry for that.
Seema, are you still there? Hi.
Oh, hi.
Hi.
Oh, you're on mute though. Would you mind unmuting?
The result that we were seeing on your research was mostly kind of like the effect of the stress that the parents have because of the money, because of the economical situation. And how would you compare it to the stress of hearing parents of the deaf children, because they don't know how to cope with their deaf children, and that makes them anxious and deal with stresses that they don't know how to solve the problem.
Mm-hmm. So I guess with the caveat that I'm not an expert here, I think the most important thing to say is that there are many, many factors that shape children's development. And so socioeconomic factors are one bucket that has been shown repeatedly to be important in helping to understand how children grow and develop. But there are clearly many other factors, right? And so if you have a parent who can't or is unable to communicate with their child, of course, that's going to have dramatic influences on that child's development that likely have very little to do with things like family income. Well, certainly family income in many ways.
Actually, I know that the difficulty of communication is there. Also, the effect of the lack of the language of the deaf child of the hearing parent is even more. But there's also stresses of both parents and of the child itself that is affecting this situation. So I was thinking that this situation might even worse for these children.
I think I think that's possible, right? I don't know of research that's directly tested that, but I think it's quite possible because you have an extra feature layered in of that child's environment that is very unusual, and that adds extra stress and communication difficulties. So I think it's quite possible.
Yes. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Thank you so much. So I also see a question from Dr. Melissa Herzig. Dr. Herzig, do you want to ask your question in ASL? Let's just wait a moment to see if she comes on camera. And we can look at what you've typed already. So Dr. Herzig asked, or stated, I would like to know if there's a difference between how the parents talk with their children in lower SES and higher SES families. Does that make a difference in brain development in your study?
So there's actually quite
well, she typed a little bit more, so I'll just finish. Well, actually, I'll let you respond to that part.
It's up to you.
Okay, so she just, actually, no, looking at it, it's okay. You can just answer that part.
Okay, sorry, I didn't see that question. So there's a good amount of data from lots of research groups looking at socioeconomic disparities in the amount of parent-child talk, and not just the amount, but the quality and nature of that parent-child talk. And over and over again, we see disparities both in the amount of words that kids hear and in the responsiveness and back and forth conversational interactions that they engage in. So there is some work suggesting that this quality of the home language environment may in part account for socioeconomic links with children's outcomes, especially language outcomes. Sorry, I'm speaking quickly now. In fact, we have some work suggesting that these differences in parent-child talk can be explaining socioeconomic differences in brain structure in language supporting regions. So your insight is absolutely right that this seems to be an important factor contributing to socioeconomic disparities in children's outcomes. Now, we are looking at that in babies' first years a little bit. So we have, we're asking mothers questions about the kinds of activities they engage with their children in at home. We also, at age 1, before we were cut off by the pandemic, we're having mothers engage in a free play interaction with their children, where we actually were video recording and coding parent behaviors and also measuring the number of words they were using. Again, that's a smaller sample, so we're not seeing big differences yet, but we'll be repeating that at age 4, hopefully with a larger sample, so we'll be able to see if we do see any differences as a result of reducing poverty.
Great, thank you so much. I see another question that just came up about ethical concerns.
Yeah, I saw that. Oh no, I thought it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, well, this person was just wondering if participants knew whether they were in the low or high cash group,
yes,
and if they knew that there was an alternate group. So
yes,
were they blind to the randomization or to which one they were assigned
to? Great question. So initially, for the first, I don't know, few dozen participants, we were thinking we will tell them that the computer will randomly pick the amount that they will get each month, but we weren't going to tell them, you know, what the 2 amounts were because we didn't want anyone to feel disappointed. And then we realized, so even before the study launched, long before we had any results, even before the first participant was recruited, the study had gotten a fair amount of press already, you know, with journalists writing about the study that was going to be happening. And in those newspaper reports, a number of them published the amounts of the monthly cash gifts. And so it occurred to us, maybe this was a bad idea, because we certainly wouldn't want a mom in the $20 a month group to, at some later date, read about the study in the newspaper and then feel very upset that she was never told what these two different amounts were. So I actually changed course early on in recruitment and began telling the moms, the computer is going to pick, you'll either, if you want to, you'll either get $333 a month or $20 a month. I don't have any say over it. Do you want to participate and find out what the computer randomly picks for you? And then we went back and, notified the first few dozen participants about the two amounts so that they would be told as well. And it turns out that most people, when presented in that situation, maybe there was a little mild disappointment, but nobody, got really upset or visibly angry. I think people understood that, if there was a chance and they might get one or they might get the other. And even $20 a month when you're not expecting it is a nice thing to find out that you're going to be receiving.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with that. Okay, let's see. There's another new question here. About whether you expect to see any differences in the development of brain structures in kids who have siblings or are in a big family or a large family or an only child. What have you seen, if any, of differences related to that, and what might you expect to see?
It's such a great question. So we did not limit our study to, firstborn children or, any particular number of children in the home. To date, we haven't seen big differences in the two groups as a function of number of children in the home, but you could imagine reasons that might push it one way or another, right? Obviously, if you only have one child, that's fewer people to divide the resources among. On the other hand, parents who have multiple children maybe tend to be older. They tend to be, have more experience dealing with family finances. And so it's not immediately clear, actually, who would benefit from it the most. We do have plans to put in a grant proposal this summer to actually begin following up with the older siblings of these target children, because these children, right, the older
really
siblings
cool.
will have
I was actually wondering
the
that
same amount. Yeah, they will have received the same amount of cash or been alive for the entire time. And so we'll actually be able to look at family resource allocation, as well as get a hint of an idea about sensitive periods, right? Because if we are looking at the same amount of cash gift received in early childhood in the first few years of life compared to later in childhood, and we will be able to look and see to what extent does age of receipt of economic resources matter for the impact.
Yeah, that definitely seems interesting. Like if one sibling is already 13 when their family started getting the additional cash gift, like how much of an impact did that have on their development versus siblings at another age? Okay, so maybe in these last few minutes, and I apologize, I've now got lighting on me that is not great. So in our last few minutes, maybe we could talk about some real life connections with recent changes to policies, because during the pandemic, as we know, the president authorized a new child care tax credit that I'm actually getting. So as a recipient, I can say that it's great. But now that it's stopped, how has your work been impacted by that? Like, what are some real life examples, if you've had any exciting interactions with policymakers? Have you been involved in any of those conversations?
Yeah, great questions. So just for those who may be less familiar with it, historically, the child tax credit was about $2,000 a year for families with children up to a certain income level. And historically, though, it was a tax credit, which meant that you only received the credit if you earned enough money to owe federal income tax. And so what that meant was that the poorest 20% or so of families were systematically excluded from that benefit, which is kind of ironic, right? And in many ways, it is an unconditional cash transfer. You get it if you have children and no one tells you how to spend it, or follows that, requires that you do anything in particular in order to get that money. But the poorest families were excluded. And so what the Biden administration did with the American Rescue Plan and had proposed in Build Back Better was to expand this child tax credit in several ways. So first of all, they made it larger. So it was $300 to $360 per month per child. Okay. And they made it fully refundable. And that meant that even if you didn't owe enough money or earn enough money to owe income taxes, you would still get access to that benefit. And so that was in place until December of 2021. And it, by some estimates, it cut child poverty in half, right? Unfortunately, it expired and it doesn't look like it's going to be included in Build Back Better legislation. So we're sort of back to where we were previously. In terms of the impact on our study, so it is complicated that, in the midst of our study, we had this global pandemic, which had lots of health and employment ramifications for the moms in our study. And then on top of that, they got stimulus checks and the child tax credit. So
I'm sure that really added several layers of complication there.
Exactly. So, we're still collecting information from the moms on what exactly they received. So the beauty of an RCT, of a randomized controlled trial, is that we will always be able to measure the impact of our cash gift. But the context of that cash gift has changed at various points over the course of the study. So to some extent, we'll be able to see, do we see differences in the impact of our fixed cash gift as a function of when families were, when we touched base with the families. And yeah.
That makes sense. Yeah. All right. Well, I think that we can go ahead and close out our session for this afternoon. I don't want to stop. This has been a great presentation, and there's been some amazing discussion and conversation that's been happening. So thank you so much, Dr. Noble. Thank you to our audience members for attending. Thank you all so very much. Thank you also to our interpreters.
Yes.
And we look forward to seeing more research come out of your study and from your team, Dr. Noble, in the not too distant future. It seems like you'll have a lot to report for years to come. So thank you so much. Please join me in giving a round of applause to Dr. Noble, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me. It was really my pleasure, and thank you to the interpreters. That is a really difficult job, and I'm very grateful.
Thanks again. All right, take care.
Bye.
Just say thank you again.
Oh, thank you.
Really appreciated your talk.
No, my pleasure. Was that speed okay? It's actually a huge working memory thing as a presenter, right? Usually you just go, and I have to like, intentionally slow down and then remember where to pick it up.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome.
Funny thing that I've noticed in reading your articles is that we have a lot of people in common between us. I think you started at UCLA soon after I left or something, but I used to work in Elizabeth Sowell's lab.
Oh, funny.
Back in the day. So it was funny to sort of relive those days when I was reading your articles.
That's so funny. No, I was never at UCLA, but we collaborated. And,
okay. That makes sense.
I have some other collaborators who used to be there, or some who still are, actually. So that's
Suzanne Houston was a co-author.
Was a grad student of Elizabeth's when we did that paper together.
Wow, amazing. Well, thank you so much. And Ilaria, thank you for everything you've done organizing this.
This was great.
Thank you. Thank you. It's all yours. Amazing presentation.
Thank you so much.
I think
take care, everyone. Bye.
That most of our participants have left. So I think that we can go ahead and close out. All right. Bye.